know much about Churchill. He's a good writer.
That's so fun. It's so fun to know that kind of stuff.
So listen to this.
Talk to this guy for hours on the phone.
So Jerry, listen to the first 2 pages. Just the first 2 pages. It's what, 4-minute read. It's worth listening.
Go ahead. Yeah, no, yeah.
The French had collapsed. The Dutch had been overwhelmed. The Belgians had surrendered. The British army, trapped, fought free and fell back toward the Channel ports, converging on a fishing town whose name was then spelled Dunkirk. Behind them lay the sea. It was England's greatest crisis since the Norman conquest, vaster than those precipitated by Philip II's Spanish Armada, Louis XIV's triumphant armies, or Napoleon's invasion barges massed at Boulogne. This time, Britain stood alone. If the Germans crossed the Channel and established uncontested beachheads, all would be lost, for it is a particularity of England's island that its southern weald is indefensible against disciplined troops. In AD 61, Queen Boudica of the Iceni rallied the tribes of East Anglia and routed the Romans at Colchester, St. Albans.
Wallachia, I think. Sorry.
Routed the Romans at Colchester, St. Albans, and London, cutting the 9th Legion to pieces and killing 70,000. But because the nature of the southern terrain was unsuitable for the construction of strong points, new legions under Paulinus, arriving from Gaul, crushed the revolt, leaving the grief-stricken queen to die by her own hand.
God, incredible summary.
And now, the 220,000 Tommies at Dunkirk, Britain's only hope, seemed doomed. On the Flanders beaches, they stood around in angular, existential attitudes, like dim purgatorial souls awaiting disposition.
Angular what?
Existential attitudes.
Oh my God.
Like dim purgatorial souls awaiting disposition. There appeared to be no way to bring home more than a handful of them.
He's talking about the guys that on the shore at Dunkirk?
Yeah, the British
oh my God, that's
the expeditionary.
The Royal Navy's vessels were inadequate. King George VI has been told they would be lucky to save 17,000. The House of Commons was warned to prepare for hard and heavy tidings. Then from the streams and estuaries of Kent and Dover, a strange fleet appeared.
The whole book is this good.
No, I mean, I'm talking about the history now.
Then from the streams and estuaries of Kent and Dover, a strange fleet appeared. Trawlers and tugs, scows and fishing sloops, lifeboats and pleasure craft, smacks and coasters, the island ferry Gracie Fields, Tom Sopwith's America's Cup Challenger Endeavour, even the London Fire Brigade's fire float Massey Shaw, all of them manned by civilian volunteers, English fathers sailing to rescue England's exhausted, bleeding sons. Even today, what followed seems miraculous. Not only were Britain's soldiers delivered, so were French support troops. A total of 338,682 men. But wars are not won by fleeing from the enemy, and British morale was still unequal to the imminent challenge. These were the same people who less than a year earlier had rejoiced in the fake peace bought by the betrayal of Czechoslovakia at Munich. Most of their leaders and most of the press remained craven. It had been over 1,000 years since Alfred the Great had made himself and his countrymen one and sent them into battle transformed. Now in this new exigency, confronted by the mightiest conqueror Europe had ever known, England looked for another Alfred. A figure cast in a mold which by the time of the Dunkirk deliverance seemed to have been forever lost. England's new leader, were he to prevail, would have to stand for everything England's decent, civilized establishment had rejected. They viewed Adolf Hitler as the product of complex social and historical forces. Their successor would have to be a passionate Manichaean who saw the world as a medieval struggle to the death between the powers of good and the powers of evil, who held that individuals are responsible for their actions and that the German dictator was therefore wicked. A believer in martial glory was required, one who saw splendor in the ancient parades of victorious legions through Persepolis and could rally the nation to brave the coming German fury. An embodiment of fading Victorian standards was wanted, a tribune for honor, loyalty, duty, and the supreme virtue of action. one who would never compromise with iniquity, who could create a sublime mood and thus give men heroic visions of what they were and might become. Like Adolf Hitler, he would have to be a leader of intuitive genius, a born demagogue in the original sense of the word, a believer in the supremacy of his race and his national destiny, an artist who knew how to gather the blazing light of history into his prism and then distort it to his ends, an embodiment of inflexible resolution who could impose his will and his imagination on his people, a great tragedian who understood the appeal of martyrdom and could tell his followers the worst, hurling it to them like great hunks of bleeding meat, persuading them that the year of Dunkirk would be one in which it was, quote, equally good to live or die, end quote, who could, if necessary, be just as cruel, just as cunning, and just as ruthless as Hitler, but who could win victories without enslaving populations, or preaching supernaturalism, or foisting off myths of his infallibility, or destroying, or even warping, the libertarian institutions he had sworn to preserve. Such a man, if he existed, would be England's last chance. In London, there was such a man.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
Who wrote that?
Manchester.
Manchester. Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I'll bet.
Unbelievable. Wow, but at
I'll
the end
read
there, I
them.
was kind of thinking,
I'll
is
read them.
this Churchill writing about himself?
No, it's I'll
That
bet.
was William Manchester?
Yeah.
That is a hell of a piece of writing.
Yeah.
That's his opening.
Yeah.
That's his opening.
That's his prelude.
That's what I call sometimes a cold.
Yeah, no, I've always thought that it's the scale, the human scale that we've lost. Everything's gotten too big. Businesses, governments, corporations.
Okay, so listen to this. Listen to this. This is Roger Scruton, the philosopher that Steve was telling you about.
Yeah.
Okay. So he's talking about Spengler and the decline of the West and how in a lot of ways Spengler got it right, in a lot of ways he didn't get it right.
Oh yeah, right.
And he says, he basically says the American Revolution, not the French Revolution, is the hinge of the West. And it's because of America, its successes, its conflicts, its symbolic importance in the world, that the question raised by Spengler is still with us, the question of Western identity. Take away America, its freedom, its optimism, its institutions, its Judeo-Christian beliefs, its educational tradition, and little would remain of the West, besides the geriatric routines of a now toothless Europe. Add America to the discussion, and all the dire prophecies and mournful valedictions of the 20th century seem faintly ridiculous. Yet, precisely because the West now depends upon America, a country launched on a path that recognizes no place and no time as its own, Western identity has become an urgent matter of debate. In referring to Western civilization, we are not, like Spengler, describing some localized and time-bound fragment of human history. We are describing a project which grew from great events in the Mediterranean basin 2 millennia ago, and which now engages the aspirations and the antipathies of all mankind. This project can endure, it seems to me, only if it can win a place in our emotions. The American experiment has produced two great gifts at the feet of mankind: viable democracy and masterful technology. But those benefits, which attract our praise and our pride, do not conquer our heart. They do not in themselves create the deep attachment upon which the future of our civilization depends. They provide no outlook on human life and its meaning that can stand up either to the sarcastic nihilism of the West's internal critics or to the humanist bigotry of Islam. In the face of such enemies, we need to affirm our achievement, not our achievements, but our right to exist. Christianity enabled us to do this by providing a vision of God's grace and our salvation. And so long as our civilization endures, that vision will have force for us. But it is no longer a militant vision. Such strength as it has derives from the shared meanings conveyed to us by our culture. Meanings conveyed equally by one who believes and the one who doubts. For that very reason, however, culture has begun to have a new importance for us, as the repository of a threatened store of moral knowledge. Perhaps one day our culture will no longer be taught. If that happens, then the ideals and attachments that have come down to us will disappear, and our civilization will stand unprotected against the rising flood of the world's resentment.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Yes, it is.
In fact, I gotta borrow. I don't know that book. I gotta borrow that and write that down because I'm introducing him next month,
At the same time,
For a book release.
At the same time, the decline in religious faith means that many people, both skeptics and vacillators, began to repudiate their cultural inheritance. The burden of this inheritance, without the consolations on offer to the believer, becomes intolerable and creates the motive to scoff at those who seek to hand it on.
Oh man, that is good.
Our educational institutions offer privileged positions to those who disparage the old values, old hierarchies and old forms of social order. There is nothing to teach in the name of culture, they tell us, except the prejudices of other ages. And they support this position with a variety of arguments seized from the armory of philosophical skepticism, and put forth in proof of the view that there is no objective procedure, no authority, no secure canon of classics that would entitle us to judge one cultural product as superior to another. In the field of culture, they argue, anything goes, and also nothing. I'm going on about dead white males. And he says,
I'm just a pre-dead white male.
but only a very shallow reading of Chaucer or Shakespeare could see that these writers as endorsing the societies in which they lived, or would overlook the far more important fact that their works hold mankind to the light of moral judgment, and examined with all the love and all the pity that it calls for in the frailty of human nature. It is precisely the aspiration towards universal truth, towards a God's eye perspective on the human condition, that is the hallmark of Western culture. And for that reason, we should see the French Revolution, the American Revolution, rather than the French, as the turning point in our history. The moment when Western civilization became identical with the modern world. That was the moment when the Enlightenment took power. And he goes on and talks about what his book is going to be about. And here's his last paragraph. If culture is to be a valid subject of study, therefore, and a vehicle for judgment, it must be possible to identify the places, the people, and the practices in which it lives. I have tried to indicate a few developments in which we can discern a new dawn after the night of repudiation, and a new attempt to recapture the ideals and emotions that have distinguished our civilization and justified its being. I point to some of the ways in which the disasters of modernism and its postmodern aftermath are being overcome, as the old ways of simplicity and humility are being recovered. This small-scale work of renewal is far more important, it seems to me, than all the loudmouth blather of repudiation. It benefits those whose interests in education direct them towards art, literature, and philosophy. But it also benefits the entire civilization to which these people belong, and which depends in 1,000 secret and not-so-secret ways on the transmission of cultural knowledge. To those who doubt this, I point to the example of Islam, contrasting what it was when it had a genuine culture with what it is today, when that culture is remembered only by powerless scholars and belligerent ignorance is without the voices that might have corrected it.
What's that? What culture and
Culture counts.
culture counts? What's the date? What's the pub date on that? Do you know?
2010, I think.
I missed that one. Yeah, it's getting cool all of a sudden. Here comes the fog.
2007.
Oh, okay.
5 years old. I've got his.
And then
lectures.
he has another book coming out soon.
Gifford lectures.
Yeah.
His Gifford lectures on what we lose when we lose religion.
Those are his Gifford lectures?
No,
Yeah.
it's coming out next week.
He just cranks out stuff like you can't believe.
I've got it pre-ordered from
But I
Amazon.
thought you said that he wrote a book on the environment.
Yeah, well, it's already out in England. It comes out here.